Blog Talk Radio.
Another episode of the Batcave, a series of fast-paced 30-minute political shows aimed at opening the eyes of America to what is currently taking place in our country. I'm your host, Batmobile, and our guest today will be a man who last year became the Tea Party favorite for the 2010 Alaska Senate seat and who initially defeated Republican incumbent Lisa Murkowski in the primaries, only to be challenged by Murkowski again in a well-funded, union-backed write-in campaign which ended in his losing the general elections to Murkowski in a somewhat controversial manner, Mr. Joe Miller. Welcome to the show, Joe. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for having me, Carlos.
All right, Joe. Now, can you tell us a little about your background and your career so we get an idea as to who Joe Miller really is?
Sure. I grew up in a lower middle-class family in Kansas, northwest of Salina, rural area. I'm actually come from 5 generations of Kansans on both sides of the family, and I grew up kind of in farm country. Kind of my youth days were during the time frame of the Vietnam War, of course, winding down. We were in the middle of course, advancing our technology in space. We, of course, reached that malaise under Carter and then had the sudden burst of patriotism under Reagan. And during the Reagan era, I really felt that I needed to do something for my country. Then high school, decided to apply for schooling at the military academies. Ultimately ended up going to West Point. Went to West Point and then served active duty after that in Desert Storm. After Desert Storm, got out, went to law school, and then went up to Alaska. I mean, it was a childhood dream kind of to come up here. It's kind of the last frontier, if you will. Loved hunting fish when I was a kid. Always dreamed of Alaska as providing those kind of opportunities beyond what I could experience in the lower 48. And once I got up here, practiced law for a firm in Anchorage. It was a pretty aggressive schedule as a young attorney. Not a lot of time to really enjoy Alaska. I wasn't able to get involved politically. It was just a real, let's put it this way, I came to Alaska for something other than that. And one day I was in the law library working on a case for a client and saw posted on a bulletin board an advertisement for a magistrate position. The state was hiring a judicial officer for the Tote District. And I called my wife, and we kind of joked about it. The deadline was actually that day. She said, yeah, go ahead, apply. We faxed the application into the Fairbanks District and was interviewed, appointed to the position at the time as the youngest state magistrate in the state, and spent about 4.5 years out really in Bush, Alaska, getting to do that hunting that I wasn't able to do when I first came up, but also got to really confront some of the issues facing rural Alaska, interfaced with the native communities. I got to see some of the rural justice issues that are facing the state.
And that's how you got involved in your career in politics?
Not yet. My kids kind of decided after 4.5 years in Tote that they wanted to experience more of the city life, and there was a U.S. magistrate judgeship that opened in Fairbanks. So I applied to that, was appointed at the time of that appointment the youngest U.S. magistrate judge in the nation. And the only reason why I mentioned those two factors, Alaska really offers lots of opportunity. It's a young state. There are lots of issues, problems up here, but there's also lots of opportunity. And both of those judicial positions were opportunities I don't think I probably would have been able to achieve anywhere else. But spent a couple of years doing that. I was in one of the most liberal districts in the state of Alaska. The University District in Fairbanks historically had a Democrat holding that seat, and I couldn't suffer it. Even though I was U.S. magistrate judge, I thought, this is just not right. We're in a fairly conservative state. We're represented by this, not just left of center. I mean, this guy's a far left guy. And so I decided to take him on, even though he's an incumbent. The party leadership said, Joe, you don't have a chance. But I was all in. I resigned from my U.S. magistrate judgeship to do it, and put a lot of my personal assets on the line, and we came within 3 points of unseating him.
Wow.
We had a contested Republican primary, beat the Republican who had run periodically for that seat, and then went on and had a very energetic race, which, again, was 300 votes, so a very, very close race.
Oh, and, excellent.
That's really what got me engaged politically, because it was recognized as a win, even though it wasn't, in the sense that I think the closest, Lisa Murkowski's sister had run for that seat several years before, and I think she lost by close to 30 points. And it was seen as kind of a surprise as to how close we came. And I was soon thereafter appointed to the district chair of my district. And then just several weeks after that, I became the Interior Regional Chair of the Republican Party. I think there were 6 regional chairs at the time. And so that really was the start point. And it was very clear to me soon thereafter that the state of Alaska had some corruption issues and was not impressed with party leadership. And so I led a rebellion and tried to unseat the party chair. It was in his midterm, and we knew that we'd have to have a 2/3 vote to do it. This has been the rules, and we almost got it. We had over a majority of the delegates with us. This was the 2008 convention, but fell shy, and that was really the last political act that I did prior to running for the U.S. Senate. Not a lot of statewide recognition. I mean, the effort against the party chair did obviously get some state coverage. Certainly the race up here in the interior got a little bit of coverage, but not real well known at the time that I decided to jump in.
Right. Well, Sarah Palin endorsed you as the Tea Party favorite last year, which helped propel you to victory over Lisa Murkowski in the Republican Senate primaries of Alaska. How confident were you after that primary victory that your only challenger come November would be the Democratic candidate, and you would no longer have to worry about Murkowski challenging you?
Well, we worked really hard in the primary to get to where we were at. We had a really solid group of supporters. They're what really put us in the victor's chair after the primary. Of course, along with Sarah Palin's endorsement. Without that endorsement, there's no way we would have won. Without those activists, there's no way we would have won.
Right.
And we knew that those activists would continue to stay with us in the general and would enhance the possibility of victory. But I will tell you that we never at any point thought we had it in the bag, and nor did we ever at any one point think that Murkowski was out of it. We found some very powerful interest in the state. The Native Corps, you mentioned union-backed. Absolutely, every union in the state supported Murkowski. I was a right-to-work advocate. Don Young, sitting in my office for several months before I declared for the seat back in April, made a comment to me that, Joe, you can never win an election in this state without the unions. Mm-hmm. At the time, he was concerned about me running for his seat, and I think it was kind of an implied threat that, watch out, I've got the unions, you don't.
Right.
But, I've never been in politics to satisfy a particular interest. My desire is to obviously get the country back on track, get the state headed in the right direction, and right to work is, to me, it's common sense. You don't want to be in a union. You shouldn't be forced into it. You shouldn't be paying dues that are being used for political activism in the wrong direction. And there are all sorts of things that we took real proud stances on, but the unions were obviously very much opposed to my candidacy, but more importantly, or more catastrophically to our race, the Native corporations were completely oriented against us because, we had made it very clear during the primary that the no-bid contracts that have just drove billions of dollars into these corporations had to change. A bankrupt government can't continue to do it. We, I think, perhaps almost equal concern to the Native corporations, made it clear that we felt that the fact that they didn't really have adequate oversight, their shareholders could not really, Senator Stevens, as well as Don Young had been effective in ensuring that these Native corporations didn't have shareholder oversight. They're exempted from SEC regulation, for example. And I made it very clear that I felt that wasn't appropriate. We had natives that supported us in our primary that were very much advocates for fairness, that wanted to bring some shareholder oversight, and the Native corporations didn't like it, and so they became very actively involved and committed in-kind value to that race and the millions of dollars against us. So it was a factor that we knew we were going to have to deal with as well. Plus, the media was universally in our state opposed to us. Normally you think about talk radio being conservative. Well, we had a couple of friendly stations, but virtually every TV station, every newspaper, there's not even one exception to that, every newspaper in the state was 100% against our candidacy.
I wanted to bring up the media there, Joe, because let's talk a little about that recording that surfaced right before your November elections last year, where some reporters from KTVA, the CBS affiliate in Anchorage, were overheard discussing how they wanted to look among all your campaign workers for any child molesters that they could find in order to make it seem like you associated with these types of people, which I completely think is an outrage. What's your take on that whole incident?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of a microcosm of what happened throughout the race. I mean, there were repeated stories in the print papers that were just completely false. I mean, outright false, that we would call, we'd tell them, look, you got your facts wrong. It's clear that you're doing just simply to defame Joe, and yet they wouldn't change it. In fact, we still have a particular entity up here that's doing it even yet today, because they're concerned about the threat that I'm going to pose in the future, I think, to some of these real entrenched corrupt interests. But what KTVA did is what pretty much everybody else did as well. And then try this on for size. So this message that was recorded, and the reason why it got recorded is the KTVA reporter accidentally dialed his phone, and the last number that he apparently had called was my spokesperson, Randy DeSoto, fellow West Point graduate, 1989. And anyway, there was a 3-minute message, I think it was about 3 minutes, where, like you said, they were conspiring to create a story about molesters in my campaign to embarrass me. We had all sorts of people that thought they knew what needed to happen in this particular instance and said, don't publicize it, Joe, don't publicize it. And I knew it had to be, because people needed to know what was going on internally in this state, not just with KTVA, but with the rest of the press. So we sent it out, and of course it went national. KTVA comes out with a press release basically saying, hey, we did nothing wrong here. On election day, after pretty much everybody had casted their votes, KTVA comes out, or maybe it was the day after, right? It was obviously after the fact. They fired the people involved. So they make a public statement saying, we've done nothing wrong, and then, of course, after it really does no good, they fire the people that were engaged in that. But those were the type of things that we faced throughout the election, not just false stories, but, the conspiracies, if you will, to create stories or to create embarrassment. The instance of the handcuffing that some people may have heard about at one of our town hall meetings. There is the way that the press covered that. I wasn't even in the building when it happened. That the people that did it weren't acting under my direction. The fact is that the journalist that was associated with that shoved this guy up against the wall so hard that they reacted. Now, I'm not saying it was a correct reaction, but the way that it was spun and the way that this whole thing got created, again, led a lot of us internally to believe that was by design, that was done in order to create embarrassment on our campaign. Well,
Joe, Sarah Palin has referred to the Alaska media as, quote, corrupt bastards. But come on, Joe, isn't this problem more widespread than just Alaska? I mean, the lamestream media seems more like hand puppets to our corrupt politicians and their string pullers. They've gone from being objective journalists to actually trying to create news by falsifying it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think any time that you've got corruption, which basically is being fed or kept alive by government money, and you've got powerful interests that surround it, you're going to find this kind of a problem. And you're exactly right. You see it at the national level. Even the so-called conservative press, it seems, is almost designed to keep what we currently have in power there. I mean, you and I both know, Carlos, that in order to get this country back on track, there's got to be a complete change in the way that D.C. does business. And we aren't talking about slowing the growth of government. We're talking about reversing the growth. We need to get back, from my perspective, to limited government. That means the 10th Amendment. The states take on the role that was intended. The federal government gets out of, frankly, a majority of what they're in today. And, the media don't want to see that. And so anybody that goes out there and says that, anybody that points out the inefficiencies in the system, anybody that says, look, you've got to shut down this government potentially in order to get the changes that need to happen, they're going to get hammered, even by the conservative press. And the reason why is there's so much quid pro quo up there. Anytime that government spends money, somebody's on the receiving end of it.
Yeah.
And very rarely is it an efficient transaction where the money's actually being put to full use. Typically, you've got somebody that's shaving off the top. And, whether it's if you want to call it the dependency or whether you want to call it the outright corruption, there is lots of money and lots of power that's designed to keep that money flowing to these corrupt interests. And at the national level, even though it may not be as obvious as what we saw with KTVA, they're a little more careful than what we saw locally, it's still there. And it will absolutely, I think, what we have to do, if you're a constitutional conservative, you really want to change the direction of government, don't take at face value what you're hearing. I mean, you need to go to a source of media that you can trust, that you can have reliance on. And we try, we kept our website up, joemiller.us, and I try to make sure that we've got a good solid, casting of articles that people can turn to and rely on. But, even some of those articles are coming out of the mainstream press, and you've got to be very careful in the way that you assess it, because there are people that are out there, there are entities that are out there that want to do everything they can to maintain the system the way it is, even though you and I know that system has got in. It can't continue to expend at the rate it is.
Absolutely. You look at the media today, and you see how they're basically trying to pick the candidates for the 2012 elections. They don't care about the best conservative. They care about whoever they have in their own pockets.
It's very interesting to watch that. I mean, the media has their picks, too. And sometimes the pick that the media selects is done with the design to then tear down that pick, once they take on a leading role, perhaps to deflate the efforts or the likelihood of success of the party that person's from. I mean, the games that are played and the coordinated effort that takes, it's shocking. But, I mean, when you look at, though, the control of media and, you look at the various interrelationships, the various media groups across the United States, it's not a real diverse group. It's a fairly small number of entities that are in that position. So, even though you might scratch your head and say, how in the world can this be coordinated? Well, when you look at the levers of control and who's pulling those levers, it really does not take a rocket scientist to figure out that it's not all that difficult. And,
right.
And part of it is also that, there doesn't even have to be direct coordination. I mean, it can just be an assessment of, okay, which of these candidates can we rely on to keep the system going in the direction it is, and which of these candidates is not controllable. I mean, that really is what it boils down to. I mean, the media is never going to support an uncontrollable candidate. They want somebody that is obedient to the system. And,
absolutely.
Frankly, we've got to have somebody that comes from outside the system and says, we can no longer head in this direction. We've got to reverse the growth of government. We've got to get back to constitutional government, and the rule of law has got to apply. We can't have this ruling class continue in the direction it's going. And, I don't know how much more time we've got, Carlos, but like you, I'm in it to make this change happen, and I'm going to continue to do everything I can.
Well, it has to happen.
That's why I'm so happy about you going forward with the show. And more people need to get out there doing the same sort of thing, create the media that we need. In other words, get out there, provide fair and balanced and truthful,
which we're not getting from we're not getting any of that. We're not getting any of that from the lamestream media. I mean, there's no truth in there whatsoever. People say Fox News. You look at Fox News. What did they do? They basically put a bait and switch on the public. They had a conservative fan base, and all of a sudden they said, let's take all the people and slowly move them to the left. They're not going to see that it's happening because we're going to sucker them into it.
It was kind of shocking in my race in that, one of the things that we had to do during our race, because the local media was just so exceptionally biased against us, is that we had to use the national media. I mean, that's the only way we could get our message out, because the local press, at first they ignored us entirely. Of course, once we won the primary, they could no longer ignore us. But then, of course, it became this consistent effort to, basically defame and also, misdescribe position and otherwise. And so the national media provided us a mouthpiece that, people in this state obviously paid attention to. But when we assessed basically the coverage and the fairness of the coverage, we got a fairer shake from CNN than we did Fox.
Isn't that something?
Now, there's exceptions to that. I mean, Neil Cavuto was phenomenal. And Neil was just 100% throughout the entire race. But there were actors in Fox, I'm not going to mention them all, but, there are two main ones that it was just unreal. And the reason why, again, I'm convinced is because, again, what we were proposing and the direction that we wanted to take the country is the only direction that we have that can save us, and it's one that's radically different than where D.C. is today. I mean, I think, the federal government ought to be involved in the military, border security, the enumerated powers, but to be engaged in all these other areas, particularly the inefficiencies, particularly given the dependency that it creates, and I'm not just talking about individual dependency, I'm talking about even the dependency you see at the state level. I mean, the state of Alaska is dependent on the federal government. 40% of our economy directly dependent on the federal government.
Right.
We have not developed our resource base, our natural resources in this state, because we're so dependent on the federal dollar. In fact, our political power has been put to extracting as many federal dollars as we can, rather than putting that political capital to trying to get the federal government to release the resources so that we can develop them. And, my perspective is that any time, again, kind of full circle back to what I said before, you've got a reform-oriented candidate that does that. I don't care whether you're Fox News or whoever. They don't like it. They don't want to see it. It upsets the apple cart, and, of course, it disturbs the vested interests that are benefiting from it.
Yeah, it's a shame. Now let's talk a little about the 2010 Senate elections in your state of Alaska last November. We know that election was not on the level because so many rules were broken in which the courts just turned their heads. You did, however, sue the courts for all the fraud that so obviously was committed. Can you tell us a little about all the election tampering that you suspected took place in that election?
Well, let's just talk briefly about the vote count itself, and this is something that anybody can understand and recognize the impropriety in. We have a machine that counts the votes automatically. It's a machine that has been banned in California because it's very easy to manipulate and get a fraudulent result from. But in my vote count, if you go to the Division of Alaska website, you'll find that my vote count was by machine. I did not get a hand count. The number of votes tallied for Joe Miller came out of a machine. And in fact, even when we told the Division of Elections, we want to pay for our own hand count, they refused us. They said, no, you can't do that. Lisa Murkowski, on the other hand, got a hand count.
Right.
If you compare her hand count to her machine count, she got thousands of more votes from the hand count than from the machine count. And that was the primary argument we made to the courts. There's all sorts of fraud. There's no question about that. I'll talk briefly about that here in a minute. But the real issue was an equal protection issue, that the Joe Miller votes were devalued compared to hers because we had a machine count that undercounted votes. She had a hand count that counted all the votes, plus some.
Well, Joe, I'd like to say that in one of the rulings against your Alaska state lawsuit, the judge on the case also wrote, quote, to allow for write-in votes with less than a perfect spelling of a candidate's name, as long as a voter's intent is clear, is common sense interpretation, which the court believes would be evident to most Alaskans. Now, isn't this just hypocrisy, Joe? When in the last 3 years have our U.S. courts actually used common sense interpretations on anything? It just seems like, it's been one case after another against we the people.
Right.
When are we going to get a fair shake?
And part of it, for us also, is a rule of law issue. I mean, here you've got a law that's been interpreted one way throughout the history of our state, and then all of a sudden you've got Lisa Murkowski on the benefiting side of a different interpretation, and you decide it that way. And the point is also, I mean, it's not just that the statute made it very clear that the name that's counted has to be the name that appeared on the Declaration of Candidacy.
Right.
It was designed that way because there was a bright line rule. If you say that, hey, we can just kind of divine voter intent, then you're leaving that up to some bureaucrat in the Division of Elections. And, this is just one of many examples, but one name that was actually counted for her was spelled Murkowshit. I kid you not. And so what? Supposed to count that? They used the syllable test, which, of course, was at one point one way and then at another point another way.
How frustrating is that? That it seems that they're only playing by the rules of the left, and we the people have no representation in the courts these days.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. I mean, the courts, don't really the rule of law doesn't seem to apply. I mean, look at the Constitution, though. It all starts there. I mean, when you take a Constitution and you make up all these powers for the federal government that don't exist there, you use a Commerce Clause and you do absolute fundamental violence to it by making it mean that you can basically do anything that you want as an all-powerful federal government. When you go into the Constitution and you make up a right from a penumbra of rights, like they did, for example, in Roe v. Wade, I mean, that type of thing leads to disrespect of other law. I mean, I just don't understand why that's difficult for people to understand. We got a Constitution the founders intended to be interpreted one way, and we've just turned it upside down on its head. And then we expect the courts to comply with the law in other areas. I mean, it really is a system that needs significant revision. And I think the start point is to get the federal government back to the Constitution, get it back to what the founders intended, and with that baseline, we can get everything else corrected. But until we do that, we can expect to see more of the same sort of activism.
Yeah, we got to vote these people out. What do you think about what's taking place in Washington, D.C. these days, Joe? And how do you think the American voters can avoid any similar election fraud such as occurred in your elections in the future for the presidential election?
Well, I mean, the key for voter fraud, and this is one of the things that we learned, this is a brand new thing for my support network. I mean, half the people, probably more than half the people that were our most active volunteers, never been involved in politics before. They were just concerned about the direction of the country. And, it is very critical that you have precinct oversight. You need to have somebody at every one of the precincts watching what's going on. In our race, there were thousands of ballots that were pre-filled out. In other words, the Murkowski folks had access to the ballots before the vote. And that's not surprising because one of the native corporations, there's a security company that took care of the private security agency that did ballot security statewide for the state of Alaska. This private security company shared members of their board of directors with Alaska, which was probably my biggest adversary as far as the native corporations go the entire election, because I spoke out against this land grab that was going on in southeast Alaska, which is basically a quid pro quo thing that actually is still under consideration in the Congress. That's something for another interview perhaps. But in any event, these ballots were filled out, same handwriting, with Lisa Murkowski's name. And, had we had observers, particularly out in western Alaska, where most of this fraud occurred, it would have been very difficult for them to have done what they did. But still, that being said, we had literally dozens of affidavits from people in Juneau that observed this, that said, hey, look, even across different precincts, we've got the same handwriting on these ballots. And still, what did that do? I mean, the court just basically threw it under the rug and said, never mind. But, again, eyes on the scene, critically important. You've got to have activism in that area. I mean, it can't just be activism for the race, but you've got to have ballot security. You've got to have somebody on the ground at the precincts. People have got to be observing what's going on and reporting what's going on so that the public is aware and they can't have some of this backroom stuff that leads to bad results. But, I think that as far as the end result goes, and this is kind of a different area than ballots, than vote integrity, ballot security, it's very important that we not compromise our vote. I think that the conservatives in this country, the constitutional conservatives, have got to look at these candidates and assess whether or not these candidates are going to be willing to reverse the growth of government and get it back to a constitutionally based government. If we're looking at a candidate that says one thing and yet the record, his or her record, is completely different from that, you better not cast the vote. And, if you evaluate a field, and you probably are aware of this, but I have a Stop Romney campaign that we started through a PAC that I'm involved with, because I believe, for example, and I'll name this name, I think Romney, given his past and given his moderate stance, is going to be almost as bad for the country as Obama, and if elected, could potentially even be worse. A Republican moderate liberal with a Republican House is probably going to do more violence to this country than an Obama.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, because he'll be flying in under the radar. People won't be looking. They'll say, look, we got a Republican, and they won't realize that it's a Republican, a crony capitalist, basically.
Well,
so, yeah.
I mean, the biggest expansion of the federal government in years. Part B Medicaid. I mean, you've got all of the stuff that Medicare, the stuff that happened there could never have happened had a Democrat been in that position with a Republican Congress. And I'm not suggesting at all that, our approach should be for that type of an objective. No, our approach would be to get a constitutional conservative in the Oval Office that is really committed. 20 or 24 of the last years, we've had either one House of Congress or we've had the presidency under Republican control. And yet government has grown to an exponential size. And yet it only required one of those entities to say no.
I want our listeners to know that we're going to be running past the usual 30 minutes because this is so interesting, and we're covering so many good topics here. But I'd like to know, because we're talking about all the candidates. I personally, when I look at Perry and I see all these dangerous executive orders that like, such as the one that he signed for Gardasil, you kind of wonder, and you say, well, do you want to go from one dictator to another? Don't you? Are we looking for a real conservative, and is that real conservative out there?
I'm not going to name any more names. I mean, there are several candidates out there that are good candidates that I think really are committed to reversing the growth of the government, and there are several that absolutely are not going to take those difficult steps. And again, for some, even though you may be very well intentioned, I don't know if we have time to talk about Reagan or not.
Absolutely.
Reagan's a phenomenal president. I'll just say it in a nutshell. Absolutely committed to getting the country back on track. He is an outside establishment candidate, and yet still, under his administration, there was some growth. You obviously cannot criticize him in any way at all, given the fact that the primary objective, defeat of the Soviet Union, he achieved that. I mean, the evil empire was the biggest concern that we had at the time, and there was just an incredible amount of benefit long-term to the country, to the world, as a consequence of the stand he took. Also, obviously committed to smaller government. But we're at a stage now today where I think compromise is something that just simply is impossible to do.
No, we can't.
If we continue to fall off the cliff, we're done.
You're absolutely right. Because when you look at what's happening right now and you say, look, we're surrounded in our own country by communists, by Islam, by crony capitalists. You need somebody to say, okay, this is a real conservative who's going to make all the drastic cuts that are needed, or we're going to be driven into the ground.
Yeah. And I don't know whether you heard this testimony earlier this week, but an economist was asking Congress, about the tipping point. Where's the tipping point? And the economist refused to answer, saying that, this could create panic. And, but the point is, we don't know when that catalyst is going to go off. But when it does, it's going to be catastrophic economically. It's going to create disruption, I think, in the social fabric of the country. And yet these people just continue to fiddle as Rome burns. I mean, they don't seem to care. They're so vested in the way things are. Or, in the alternative, I mean, there are some out there that I think understand where we're headed, but see that as an opportunity to, achieve objectives that they have.
Yeah.
Objectives toward internationalism, objectives toward increased government control.
Well, see, that is the big problem, Joe. I think that's the big problem. It starts at the top, and I think that the person in the top has an ulterior motive that most Americans either don't see or don't want to see. And, until the next year comes and, in the hopes that we make it there in one piece to actually have free and fair elections and have a decent American president be elected, we have to basically play it by ear and see what happens day after day.
Yeah, I agree. We've got to do something. We've got to be active, and we've got to provide. We've got this election, and right now the way things are headed, it doesn't look like to me that we're going to get the nominee that we need. And then the question becomes, what do we do? And that's a difficult one that that is going to be discussed, I think, around many tea parties over the coming months. But again, what I appeal to is, identify your constitutionally conservative candidate, get behind that candidate, do not compromise your vote. The country cannot suffer another moderate that is just about doing the same thing that we've done for the last 40 years.
Yeah, you're right. Now, what are your feelings on Sarah Palin running for president? Do you think she'll be running, and if she does, will she be getting your support?
I've said that publicly, in fact, as recently as last week, that my gut is she's going to do it. I think that really what it boils down to is she hasn't decided yet. I mean, I don't think she's playing games with the media or anybody else. I don't think she's trying to create publicity or play games. I really believe she hasn't decided. I know she loves this country. I know she wants to turn it around. I absolutely know that she is not an establishment candidate. I welcome her participation in the presidential election. I think that she would be absolutely a wonderful addition to the field. And we'll wait and see what she does. I mean, again, I think it's likely, but she doesn't have a lot of time. I mean, you're looking at, by some analysts, they believe that you've got about 10 days from now to really do it. And,
well, we can look back at Ronald Reagan and remember he didn't join until November, so there's still hope. And I really think that if she does run, the entire conservative movement is going to swarm around her because none of these candidates have stood out.
Hey, did you see, I don't know whether you saw this poll this past week or not, but it shows her within striking distance of Obama now. With,
and we know how
improvement over the last.
We need to take these polls with a grain of salt because we know who's behind them. So if they say she's within striking distance, for all we know, she could be 10 or 15 points in front.
Could be, absolutely, no doubt about it. But she certainly does offer something completely different than any of the others in the field do, and I think that anybody that counts her out and says there's no way, they don't understand. They don't understand where we're at as a nation, and they certainly don't understand her as a candidate.
Absolutely. Now, Joe, recently during the 9/11 ceremonies this year, First Lady Michelle Obama was seen disrespecting the American flag when she looked at her husband and said something to the effect of, quote, "All this just for a flag?" as she mockingly shook her head while her husband nodded and smirked in approval. Now, as a combat veteran of the 1991 Gulf War yourself, what are your personal feelings about that?
Well, I mean, if that is what she said, I'm disgusted by it. And, I actually put that video up on joemiller.us, and I watched it, and that does appear to be what she said.
Right.
And I guess what's even more shocking is that most people think that's what she said, just based upon her past statements and her husband's past apparent disrespect to the flag. These folk are not working in our national interest, and I don't think anybody can fairly say that they are. It just. I mean, trying to think of one thing, Fast and Furious. I mean, that's kind of the topic du jour that I think has the likelihood of creating some real problems at the upper echelons of his administration. But that's just one example. You look at his foreign policy, you look at the Arab Spring and the complete mismanagement of foreign policy in that respect. You look at the growth of government here. You look at his appointees. You look at what he's doing with the judiciary. You look at his background. I mean, here's a guy that we know less about than what the public knows about Joe Miller, U.S. Senate candidate from Alaska. You probably know about 100 times more about my background than you know about his. And when you look at that background that we do know about, his affiliation with socialists, people affiliated with the communist movement, and then you wonder why he and his wife act the way they do or why they make the apparent comments that they make that don't appear to be patriotic. I think that people are starting to understand where he's coming from. I still don't think there's a full appreciation for where he and Michelle stand vis-a-vis the country.
Well,
but I do believe that by the time this election rolls around, that the Tea Party movement's going to do a pretty darn good job of outing him and Michelle as to how their lack of patriotism, their lack of really acting in the country's best interest.
Oh, I agree with you there, but when we think about it, it's who are we to blame for the fact that America really doesn't know who these people are and their background, other than the media? The media have not done their job, since 2008 when they should have been doing it, and basically, if anything, they've been covering up for them. When you look back, thank God for the internet. Where would we be without the internet, Joe? Think about it. We've discovered so many things about his background, his personal background. Rumored drug use. I mean, things that can be verified just from different people, and just when you research and you say, is this the kind of person we really want in the White House right now? Are these the people he surrounds himself with? Are they the ones that you feel comfortable knowing that he associates with? It's just where is the media representation for the American people today? Outside of shows like this,
the media shut down all of that. Had it been a Republican candidate or a conservative candidate, they would have been all over all of those allegations. But part of it's also a lack of courage. I mean, there aren't too many people up in D.C. that really have the backbone to stand up and say, hey, hold on just a second, what about this? And, people have got to start thinking about not their political futures, but about the interests of the country. And I think you're going to see a lot more loudmouths here in the coming years, coming months, as people recognize really the crisis that we're in and the need to get things back on track. But you're exactly right. The alternative media, the Internet does provide options to us, and in fact, I'd encourage your listeners to spend a lot of time on the Internet, find legitimate, good news sources. They're out there, and make sure that you're getting a balanced approach by accessing them, because you aren't going to get that fair and balanced approach through the national media. It just simply is not going to be provided.
Absolutely, and I encourage everybody who listens to this show or any of the other shows I've done, or any show you come across where you realize, my God, I didn't know anything about this. Just share it with your friends. Let them know. And if their friends don't have a computer or whatever, you tell them in person, because we have to go one person at a time to try to take back this country. Because if you're going to rely on the mainstream media, people are not even realizing how close to the end we really are.
Yeah. Well, and fortunately, there are a lot of patriots out there that are working to provide that option. And again, encourage your listeners to utilize those resources, and if they've got the financial wherewithal to actually fund something in their own communities, because it's not just the national balanced approach that we need by getting the full news, but it's also at a local and state level. Something I read about last week, which really hit home for me, is that as things continue to fall apart at the national level, there's going to be an increasing importance at the local and state levels, and that really is where activism starts anyway. And so I would really encourage your listeners to become engaged at the political level. And, and if you've got the capacity, if you've got the wherewithal, you've got the Internet expertise where you can set up a page that people in your community can go to, that's equally important. It's very important to have that provided, something that we don't have in Alaska, that we're working to provide actually through the joemiller.us website. We're going to add an Alaska tab here in the coming months that provides some local news and local sources of information that we just simply can't get for the monopoly, the media monopoly that has frozen out that good information in the past.
That's great. Now, Joe, are we going to be seeing another political run by you in the future, do you think?
We'll see what opportunities God lays in our path. Of course, there are a number of races coming up in Alaska, including the Senator Begich race in 2014, Murkowski, of course, 2016. Don Young, who knows when he's going to retire. That's a possibility, and I've had a number of supporters encourage me to make a run for governor, too. So we'll wait and see what happens. We're staying politically active in the state. The base is still very much engaged, involved in areas of conservative importance, and I'm sure that they'll be there for a future run as well.
Excellent. Now, do you have any books in the works, Joe, for about your past and the whole election scandal?
Stafford wrote a book. It's going through revision right now. Hopefully, it'll be out here in the next month or two concerning the race and the election. It's very informative. I would encourage all your listeners, if you want to know what happened at the national level with respect to our race as well as the local level, it provides a very good explanation. One of the main benefits of this book, though, is that it reflects how hard even national Republicans worked at ensuring our defeat. And it's a real eye-opener.
Excellent. Well, Joe, we're gonna wrap it up there. We actually went 15 minutes over, but man, it's incredible all the information you've given us, because, like you said, we have to take this country back. We have to. If not, we're in deep doo-doo.
We do, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard, Carlos, and I wish you the best, and hope that you expand your program, get the word out to as many people as we can across the nation. All
right, Joe, great. It's a pleasure having you with us. Good luck with your future.
Thank you. Godspeed.
All right, America, now let's not allow the same type of election tampering that took place in Alaska last year to take place in the presidential elections of 2012, because if we do, that will surely be the end of free elections in our country as we know it. We need to keep a watch at all the polls and report any illegal activity we see immediately. Don't wait for any election fraud situation to be resolved by the law, because as the last 3 years have shown us, the majority of our courts are now working against the American people, not with us. That's going to do it for today's show. Until next time, this is Batmobile thanking you for joining us in the Batcave. God bless.